Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a fascinating but honestly deeply unsettling reality. We're going to unpack exactly what happens when the ultimate symbol of safety, the police uniform, gets completely weaponized by some of history's most notorious predators. We'll be breaking down how the very systems designed to protect us were manipulated by the very people out hunting the public. The badge is meant to be a shield. For them, it was a weapon. You know, that quote perfectly hits the nail on the head. Think about it for a second. If you're stranded on the side of the road or in serious danger, a police uniform signifies rescue, right? You're hardwired to trust it. Well, these individuals took that deeply ingrained societal trust and just completely inverted it. It wasn't just a clever disguise. The badge was an active, literal tool they used to manipulate, control, and ultimately destroy innocent lives. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the ultimate decoy, luring the vulnerable. Take a look at the 1972 case of Florida Deputy Gerard Schaefer. His methodology was just incredibly deliberate. Schaefer would be in full uniform, driving his official Martin County Sheriff's patrol car, and he'd pull over vulnerable teenage hitchhikers. He'd offer them a ride, and of course, because he was a deputy, they felt perfectly safe hopping into the car. But he used that official vehicle as bait to drive them out into remote wooded areas under the guise of taking them somewhere safe. Once they were totally isolated, the facade dropped, and his horrifying signature method of binding his victims to trees took over. 83. Just let that number sink in for a second. That is the staggering, confirmed number of women murdered by Mikhail Popkov. That makes him Russia's most prolific serial killer in history. And his method was terrifyingly simple. He would patrol the streets of Angarsk late at night in a Lada 4x4, which was the standard vehicle used by law enforcement over there. He'd offer rides to women walking alone. They got in because, again, they trusted the badge. He exploited that unquestioned trust to drive them out to remote areas and commit absolute atrocities. Moving right along, here is Section 2, Fox in the Henhouse, hiding in plain sight. So you've probably heard the phrase, fox in the henhouse, right? Well, in these cases, it's literal. This is a situation where the perpetrator is the exact person assigned to solve the crime. Both Mikhail Popkov and a New Orleans officer named Antoinette Frank had the completely audacious advantage of literally walking right onto the crime scenes they had just created. They would pretend to investigate themselves. They're interviewing suspects, handling the evidence, and entirely steering police discussions away from the truth. They used their insider knowledge of procedure to ensure they stayed completely untouchable. But here is where it gets incredibly frustrating. Sometimes the system actively ignores its own warning signs. Back in 1993, the New Orleans Police Department was desperate for officers, so they hired Antoinette Frank despite some blazing psychological red flags. She literally failed her psychological screening twice. The evaluation specifically called out poor impulse control and questionable judgment. But they gave her a badge and a gun anyway. And that systemic failure directly cost 3 people their lives when Frank and an accomplice robbed a restaurant, murdering 2 innocent civilians and a fellow police officer. Which brings us to Section 3, the collateral damage poisoning the system. 13 entirely innocent men. Over in the Soviet Union, a volunteer officer named Gennady Mikhailevich was terrorizing the city of Vitebsk, killing dozens of women. But because he was part of the citizen patrol, he was frequently assigned to investigate his own murders. He knew exactly how confessions were squeezed out of people and how cases were built. So he used that insider knowledge to frame 13 completely innocent men for his crimes. 12 of those guys were shipped off to brutal Siberian gulags, and one was tragically executed by firing squad, all while Mikhailevich just kept on killing. Now, to put a slightly different spin on this, let's look at how systemic pressures can trigger a completely different kind of dissent. In 1980s Germany, you had a veteran officer named Norbert Polka. He was absolutely crushed by roughly $400,000 in medical debt after his daughter tragically died from cancer. That financial pressure just broke him. To pay off the massive debt, he started robbing banks with a sledgehammer. But to cover his tracks, he used his police knowledge to meticulously execute innocent drivers just so he could steal their cars for his getaways. It wasn't sadism that kicked off his killing spree, it was sheer desperation that warped into methodical murder. That leads us right into Section 4, the Golden State Killer, a horrific duality. If we're talking about a horrific double life, Joseph DeAngelo is basically the textbook example. He perfectly weaponized his police training. By day, he was an officer for the Exeter and Auburn police departments, out there patrolling neighborhoods and investigating burglaries. But by night, he was the actual monster committing those exact crimes. He used his professional training to study victims' habits, learn their vulnerabilities, and know exactly how to avoid detection. He was literally out there meticulously executing the exact crimes he was being paid to solve. So, how do you finally catch someone like that? Let's dive into Section 5, Unlocking the Truth, Breaking the Facade. Ultimately, the game changer that finally brought DeAngelo down was genetic genealogy. Investigators took this decades-old crime scene DNA and just uploaded it to public genealogy databases. From there, they found distant relatives, painstakingly built out these massively complex family trees, and followed the branches right down to a 72-year-old former mechanic. They managed to collect a discarded item of his, match the DNA, and boom, the facade was entirely shattered. It was exactly the kind of unimagined technology that a killer from the 1970s could never, ever have prepared for. When you look at this timeline, it is just staggering how long he evaded capture. His reign of terror began in 1974. Interestingly, he was actually fired from the police department in 1979 for shoplifting. And get this, he stole a hammer and dog repellent, which were highly likely tools for his crimes. His killing stopped in 1986, and then he just completely vanished. For 32 years, he hid in total suburban anonymity, basically just known as the grumpy neighbor next door, until science finally caught up to him in 2018. But hey, it wasn't always just high-tech DNA that broke these facades. Sometimes it was relentless, old-school investigative profiling. For Popkov in Russia, investigators finally noticed a distinct pattern of specific police-issue Lada tire tracks at the crime scenes, which forced mandatory DNA testing for all officers. For Mikhail, he tried to throw police off with an anonymous letter, and it massively backfired when authorities literally analyzed 500,000 handwriting samples to find a match. 500,000! And for Antoinette Frank, her facade instantly crumbled right at the crime scene when a surviving sibling, who had been hiding in a walk-in cooler during the whole massacre, walked out and pointed right at her. Let's zoom out for a minute and look at Section 6, the global scope of the betrayal. Looking at this data, the sheer human toll across multiple continents is absolutely staggering. From Russia to the Soviet Union, all the way from California over to Germany, this killer cop phenomenon isn't just some isolated anomaly, it is a systemic vulnerability. Whether they were driven by sadism, a totally warped sense of morality, or crushing financial debt, the one common denominator is that the uniform provided the exact access, trust, and cover they needed to commit these atrocities. We've seen how incredible investigative persistence and major scientific breakthroughs can eventually correct these systemic failures. But let's be real, the damage left behind is permanent. So I'm going to leave you with this really chilling thought. If the monster hunting you is the exact same person society tells you to run toward in an emergency, who do you call for help? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer today.